I was 17 years old when my grandfather held my hand in a hospital bed and asked me to promise him something. I said yes before he even finished the sentence, the way you agree to anything when someone you love is dying and you'd promise them the moon if it meant one more hour with them. It took me 15 years to actually keep that promise. Not because I forgot it. I thought about it almost every single week for 15 years. I'm going to tell you exactly what he asked me to do, and exactly why it took so long, because I think the reason says something true about all of us, about the promises we make in our most sincere moments and then quietly spend years finding reasons not to keep. My grandfather, Wilhelm, was not a sentimental man. He'd grown up poor, in a small farming town, one of 6 children in a house with no extra of anything. No extra food most winters, no extra time, certainly no extra emotion spent on things that didn't need to be said out loud. He showed love the way men of his generation often did, through work, through showing up, through fixing things without being asked. He rebuilt my bicycle 3 times before I was 10. He never once said he was proud of me in words. He didn't need to. I always knew. When he got sick, it happened faster than any of us expected. 6 weeks between the diagnosis and the hospital bed where I sat holding his hand, 17 years old, trying to memorize the exact weight and warmth of it because some part of me already understood I wouldn't get many more chances to. He was lucid that afternoon, more alert than he'd been in days, and he used that clarity for exactly one thing. He told me about a letter. Decades earlier, before I was born, before my mother was even born, Wilhelm had a younger brother named Anton. They'd had a falling out in their 20s, the specifics of it mattered enormously to them at the time and, by the time he was telling me this story, had mostly faded into something neither of them could fully reconstruct anymore. Some disagreement about their father's small farm, about who had sacrificed more, about money that had long since stopped existing in any account either of them could point to. What mattered wasn't the argument. What mattered was that it never got resolved. Anton moved across the country. They exchanged perhaps 4 letters over the next 40 years, each one more distant and formal than the last, until eventually even those stopped. Wilhelm told me he'd written a letter, years earlier, that he'd never sent, an apology, an attempt to finally say the things neither of them had said in decades. He'd kept it in a small wooden box in his workshop, sealed, addressed, stamped even, and had simply never been able to make himself walk it to the mailbox. Every year that passed made it feel more impossible, not less. Too much time had gone by, too much unsaid had accumulated, and some part of him had convinced himself it was now too late to matter. Find that letter, he told me, his voice thin but absolutely clear. Find Anton, if he's still alive, and if he's not, find his children. Give them the letter. Tell them, that I was sorry, and that I ran out of time to say it myself. Don't let it end the way it's been ending, in silence, the way I let it end. Promise me. I promised. Of course I promised. I would have promised him anything in that room, in that moment, with the machines making their quiet, terrible sounds behind his voice. He died 4 days later. I found the letter exactly where he said it would be, in that wooden box in his workshop, still sealed, the stamp slightly yellowed with age. I held it for a long time that first week, and I told myself I would deal with it soon. Soon turned into 15 years. I want to walk you through exactly how that happened, not as an excuse, but because I think the specific shape of that delay is something almost everyone watching this will recognize in their own life, attached to their own unsent letter, whatever form it happens to take. In the beginning, the delay felt completely reasonable. I was 17, grieving, in the middle of finishing school. Finding a great uncle I'd never met, who might not even still be alive, felt like an enormous undertaking for someone barely old enough to drive, and everyone around me agreed it made sense to wait until I was more settled. By 19, I'd started, in a small way. I found an old address for Anton in some family papers my mother had kept, sent a short, careful letter of my own, introducing myself, explaining who I was, mentioning gently that I had something of my grandfather's I wanted to pass along. It came back 3 months later, stamped return to sender, address unknown. I remember feeling something close to relief alongside the disappointment, relief that I'd technically tried, that I now had a reasonable sounding excuse to set the whole project down for a while without feeling like I'd broken my promise entirely. That's the part one want to be honest about, because I think it's the part that actually explains 15 years, more than any single dramatic reason could. I never consciously decided to break the promise. I just kept finding small, legitimate-sounding reasons to pause it, each one perfectly reasonable on its own, that quietly accumulated into over a decade of silence. School, then a demanding first job, then a move across the country myself, then a relationship that took most of my emotional attention, then a different job, then a wedding to plan. At every single point along the way, if you'd asked me directly whether I still intended to keep the promise, I would have said yes, immediately, without hesitation. And at every single point, not right now, felt like a completely defensible answer. I think many of us carry at least one promise like this, not abandoned, exactly, never consciously broken, just perpetually rescheduled, filed under, important, but not today, for years at a stretch, while we tell ourselves, honestly, that we still fully intend to get to it. Around the 5-year mark, I did something that in hindsight I understand better than I did at the time. I took the letter out of the box where I'd kept it, and I found a new box, nicer, more solid, something that felt appropriately respectful, and I moved the letter into it. I remember feeling, in that small act, a strange sense of having done something meaningful, some quiet form of progress. I hadn't sent it. I hadn't found Anton. I had simply given the letter a nicer place to continue waiting. But some part of me needed that small ritual, I think, to feel like the promise was still alive in some form, even though nothing about its actual situation had changed at all. Before I go further, I want you to actually answer this, not just read it and keep scrolling. Is there a promise you're still carrying, to someone who's gone, or to someone you've lost touch with, that you haven't kept yet? You don't need to explain the whole story. Just name it, one sentence, in the comments. I think you'll find, reading through the replies under this video, that you are nowhere near as alone in this as it feels late at night when you're the only one who remembers you're still carrying it. The second 5 years looked different from the first, and in some ways, they were harder to forgive myself for, because by then, the reasonable-sounding excuses had mostly run out. By my late 20s, I had, by any honest measure, the time and the resources to actually find Anton, if he was still alive, or his family, if he wasn't. The internet had made this kind of search dramatically easier than it had been when I was 19 mailing a single letter into the dark. I knew this. I thought about it, genuinely, several times a year, usually around the anniversary of my grandfather's death, when the promise would surface in my mind with particular sharpness, sit there uncomfortably for a few days, and then quietly submerge again beneath the ordinary business of my actual life. I want to be honest about what was actually happening underneath the practical excuses, because I only understood it myself much later. Part of me, I think, was afraid of what I'd find. Afraid Anton might already be gone, and that I'd have arrived 15 years too late to give the letter to the one person it was actually written for, turning the whole gesture into something smaller and sadder than my grandfather had intended. And part of me, I think, was afraid of succeeding, afraid of actually finding him, actually delivering the letter, and having to sit with whatever complicated, unresolved feelings that moment might bring up, rather than the comfortable, familiar ache of simply still meaning to do it someday. That's a strange thing to admit, but I think it's more common than we like to acknowledge. Sometimes we don't avoid finishing something because it's difficult. We avoid finishing it because finishing removes a certain kind of permission to still be, in our own minds, someone who fully intends to do the right thing eventually, without ever having to find out whether the actual attempt would go the way we hoped. The turn came in an unglamorous, almost accidental way, the way most real turns in life tend to arrive, without the dramatic staging we imagine in advance. I was 32, helping my mother clear out some of my grandfather's remaining papers from a storage unit she'd been paying for uselessly for over a decade, and I found a photograph, Wilhelm and Anton, maybe 8 and 6 years old, arms around each other, unmistakably brothers, unmistakably happy, in a way that had nothing yet to do with farms or money or 40 years of silence. I sat on the floor of that storage unit for a long time holding that photograph. Something about seeing them that young, that uncomplicated, made the whole weight of the delay land on me at once, in a way 15 years of vague guilt somehow hadn't managed to. These were two little boys who loved each other before anything came between them. And I was the only person left who might still be able to do something about the distance that had grown between the men they became. I drove home that night and, for the first time in years, actually opened a genealogy website instead of just thinking about it. It took less than a week to find him. Anton was alive, 89 years old, living in a small town 4 states away, in an assisted living community. It had taken 15 years and about 6 days of actual effort to find what I could have found, I now understood, at almost any point along the way, if I'd simply been willing to sit with the discomfort of actually trying instead of the comfort of still meaning to. Now, some of you might be thinking, 15 years is an extreme case, surely most delayed promises aren't quite that dramatic. Maybe not in scale. But I'd gently push back on the idea that the mechanism is different. Whether it's a 15-year-old promise to a dying grandfather or a phone call you've been meaning to make for 3 months, the actual psychology tends to be identical, a string of individually reasonable pauses, each one legitimate in isolation, accumulating into a delay that would look, from the outside, deliberately unreasonable, if anyone ever added up all the small pauses at once. The lesson isn't, you're a bad person for this. Almost everyone does some version of it, with something. The lesson is that the accumulation is invisible from the inside, one reasonable pause at a time, and the only real fix is noticing you're doing it before a decade quietly passes, rather than after. So here's what I'd actually ask you to do with this. First, name your letter. The specific promise, apology, or overdue action you're still carrying, the one that surfaces at predictable moments and then quietly submerges again. You can't interrupt a pattern you haven't clearly named. Second, notice your own version of moving it to a nicer box. The small, symbolic gesture that feels like progress but isn't, the note you rewrite instead of send, the plan you refine instead of execute. These rituals feel meaningful. They're often just a more comfortable way of continuing to wait. Third, ask yourself honestly what you're actually afraid of, the way I eventually had to. Fear of a bad outcome, and fear of a good one that requires you to let go of the comfortable, familiar identity of someone who still means to, are more similar than they first appear, and naming which one is actually operating changes what you need to do next. Fourth, take the smallest possible real step within the next 24 hours. Not the whole task. One search. One message. One phone call to ask a single question. The goal isn't completion. It's breaking the seal that's kept the promise purely theoretical for however long you've been carrying it. Fifth, forgive the years it already took. I spent real time being quietly ashamed of the 15 years, time I could have spent simply being grateful I still had the chance at all. Self-punishment for the delay doesn't speed up the eventual action. It just adds another layer of avoidance, because shame is exhausting, and exhausted people rarely move toward the things that shame them. I called the assisted living community 2 days after finding the listing, and a staff member confirmed that Anton was indeed a resident there, and that he was, in her words, having a good week, alert, clear, able to receive visitors. I didn't trust myself to explain everything over the phone. I asked if I could simply come see him, and she said yes. I drove 4 states with the letter on the passenger seat, the same seat, more or less, where a box of my grandfather's belongings had once sat in a different car, 15 years earlier. I had a great deal of time, on that drive, to rehearse what I might say, and none of what I'd rehearsed survived contact with the actual moment. Anton was smaller than I expected, the way elderly people often are compared to the photographs we hold of them in our minds, sitting by a window with a book he wasn't really reading. I introduced myself, Wilhelm's grandson, and watched something shift in his face, somewhere between confusion and a very old, very careful kind of hope, the kind you allow yourself only when you've spent decades specifically trying not to hope for something. I gave him the letter. I told him it had been 15 years since my grandfather died, and that I was deeply sorry it had taken me that long to bring it to him, and that whatever I said now couldn't fully make up for the delay, but that I hadn't wanted to let it go any longer. He held the envelope for a long moment without opening it, running his thumb along the edge of it, the way you might touch something you genuinely stopped believing you'd ever actually hold. Then he asked me, very quietly, to read it to him, because his eyes weren't what they used to be, and because, he said, he thought he might want a familiar voice in the room while he heard it, even a voice he'd never heard before that afternoon, one that at least carried some trace of his brother in it by blood, if not by memory. I'm not going to tell you every word of that letter, because some things belong to the people who wrote and received them, and I think that's exactly as it should be. What I'll tell you is that it was an apology, direct, unguarded, entirely unlike the careful, undemonstrative man I'd known my whole life. 40 years of silence, it turned out, had not been indifference on my grandfather's part. It had been exactly the opposite, a wound he'd never stopped carrying, that he'd simply never found the specific courage to address while there was still time. Anton cried without any embarrassment at all, the unguarded way people cry when they're old enough to have stopped performing composure for anyone's benefit but their own. When I finished reading, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I always wondered if he thought about it. I'm glad I finally know he did." He asked me to tell him about Wilhelm's life, the parts after the falling out, the parts Anton had missed for 40 years. I stayed most of the afternoon. Anton passed away 8 months after that visit. I'm grateful, in a way I don't think I can fully explain, that the timing worked out the way it did, that 15 years of delay somehow still left just enough room at the very end for the letter to arrive before it would have been too late in the way that actually cannot be undone. I think about how easily it could have gone differently. Anton could have passed before I finally opened that genealogy website. The letter could have stayed in its nicer, more respectful box indefinitely, a private, permanent monument to an intention that never quite became an action. I don't say that to frighten anyone watching this into panic. I say it because I think it's the honest, unglamorous truth underneath stories like this one. Most of the time, we don't get a clean, dramatic deadline warning us that the window is closing. It simply closes, quietly, on some ordinary day we don't get advance notice of, and the only real protection against that is not waiting for the deadline to reveal itself before we finally act. I still have the letter my grandfather's brother wrote back, the one he asked me to bring home and keep, once he understood I was the last living thread connecting the two halves of that broken conversation. I haven't opened the box it's in for a while now. But I know exactly where it is. And I think, this time, I understand the difference between that and simply meaning to know. So here's what I'd ask of you, genuinely, before you close this video. Go find your letter, whatever form it actually takes for you, whoever it's actually addressed to. And take one real step toward it today, however small, before, someday, quietly becomes 15 years, the way it very nearly did for me. Tell me in the comments what your letter is. I read every single one, and I think you'll find, more than almost any other video I've made, just how many people are carrying some version of exactly this. Some promises don't wait for us to feel ready. They just wait. Until, one day, they can't anymore.